Na mô tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Na mô tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Na mô tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Blessings. Good evening to everyone from a hotel room in Adelaide City, South Australia. I can say this is one of the most unusual Wesak celebrations I've been in since I've been a Buddhist, since I've been a Buddhist monk. Never thought I would be celebrating the Buddha's birth, enlightenment and parinibbana from a hotel room. But as you probably know, the requirements of Australian government are such that having returned from my mother's funeral in the UK, this is where I have to be for another 2 days. And it coincides with this auspicious day in the Buddhist calendar. So I guess in a way it's good to bring a bit of the Buddha's joy to the CBD of a city in Australia, in a place where perhaps, you know, they've never had a Vesak celebration before, although I'm sure as a big hotel there may be Buddhists who have stayed here or are staying here, I don't know. But it is a day of joy for Buddhists, and perhaps particularly this year, you know, celebrating the Buddha, remembering the Buddha, usually does bring up joy, what we call piti and pamoja, joy and rapture, these qualities that come with the arising of faith, remembering the Buddha, who he was, what he practiced, the teachings and the qualities that he inspires in us. You know, these qualities of joy and faith and rapture tend to arise. And Ajahn Chah used to say this is the food for the heart, the food for the mind. And at this time in the world, when particularly there's a lot of stress and worry over the pandemic in particular, as well as all the normal worries of daily life and the normal sufferings and stresses of daily life, but perhaps at this time it's a bit heightened. So anything that is a source of this spiritual food, the rapture, the joy that comes from remembering the Buddha is very welcome, I think, for many people. I'm a monk, so I live in a monastery. So every day we chant, we see the Buddha statue, we're practicing the rules of training that the Buddha gave us, we meditate. So we perhaps have an advantage because we're surrounded by Buddhist paraphernalia, and every day people come to offer food, hear teachings, make merit and so on. And so that's been reinforced all the time. But I'm aware that for many Buddhists, and the majority of Buddhists, they're not monks or nuns. So you're living at home, and often it can seem a little dry or barren as far as some of the joys that you get from recollecting the Buddha go, unless you work very hard. Because the rest of the world is not that interested in the Buddha and his message and the practice. And so you're not only working with your own mind to keep it on track, to follow the Buddha's teachings and recollect the Buddha and the Dhamma, you're also working with the fact that the people around you maybe are not that supportive or interested. So it's like a double obstacle you're having to deal with. So at least this day, we can quite firmly and clearly bring our mind to recollect the Buddha. And as the full moon comes up tonight, they're calling it a super moon. You know, they give it these gimmick names now, but it's just the full moon in May. It's the day that the Buddha was born, became enlightened and passed away into parinibbana. So as the full moon comes up, it's a time to really rejoice in your good fortune, that you have come into contact with the Buddha and his teachings, and that they're still left in the world for us to practice after 2,000, almost 2,600 years. This is our good fortune, and that just that thought alone brings joy to my heart, and I hope it brings joy to your heart. And when I say joy, I'm saying mean this food for the heart, this spiritual delight, enjoyment, happiness that's of a more subtle nature than the normal pleasures of the world that we seek to distract ourselves with and indulge in to get away from some of the stresses of being a human being. You know, we are seeking that all the time, often to the point where we ignore this more subtle, more profound pleasure of the happy heart, recollecting things that are skillful and wholesome, such as the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. But and because of this pandemic, you know, where people are constantly caught into worry, anxiety, and there's a lot of change going on. Just today, South Australia closed its borders to people from Melbourne. So there's been a group of monks who had to quickly leave our monastery to drive down here to battle with time, as it were, to get over the border before they closed the border because of the outbreak of COVID in Melbourne at the moment. And fortunately, they managed to make it, even though they were an hour late. I believe the police have let them through because they had good reason to travel back to our monastery here in South Australia. You know, there's change going on every day now in Australia and in every part of the world, whether you're in Penang, Malaysia, Europe, North America, wherever. This pandemic is truly global, and it's truly affected every single person on the planet in one way or another, some more seriously, some more mildly, but everyone's been affected and is constantly being affected. And what was the Buddha's last teaching to us? Is, you know, students, you know, for the students of future generations, the Buddha in his wisdom knew that there would be people following his teachings in 100, 1,000 years after his death. What was his last teaching to us? Well, it was what we call the Pajjima Wada, the last teaching, that all formations are subject to change, they're impermanent. So continue to bring your practice to completion with diligence and heedfulness. So be heedful of change, you might say, is his last message to us. Why did he do that? Well, look at your own life at this time. How many people in this last year, because of the pandemic, have been saying things like, when are we going to get back to normal? Or I wish it was like it was before. When are things going to go back to how they were before? And if you stop and think about the frustration of having to deal with pandemic and all the changes that have come, you know, it's going against what the Buddha taught, in the sense the Buddha was pointing to the basic truth that everything is changing every second of every minute of every hour of every day of every week of every year. The world is constantly in a process of change. And the Buddha said, because the world is in a process of change all the time, be heedful, practice with heedfulness, meaning be careful, be alert, be ready for the next change. So expect it. It's another way you could put it, is just expect change, because that's the way of the world that we live in. Whether you're talking about the physical world, this body that we inhabit, that we were born with from our mother's womb and grow up with and eventually will die, and then our mind, our mental activity, what we see, hear, taste, touch, smell, our memories, our thoughts, our feelings, our sense consciousness is always changing. That's a basic truth of life that is liberating when we become mindful of it and aware of it. And the Buddha, in his wisdom, recognized that. So his very last teaching, his gift to us as his students in these later years, later generations, is that things are changing, so be mindful. Be mindful means keep it in mind. recollect that truth, use it almost like as a tool to help understand the way things are better and to free or liberate your mind from suffering. So when you do face these changes from the pandemic, you know, the next lockdown, the next set of rules, the next person you know who got ill or recovered, questions about vaccination, travel restrictions, all the things that directly or indirectly affect us, when they come up and you start thinking, when's it all going to be over? When's it going to be like it was before? Just pause and remind yourself, what should I do at this moment? You know, the Buddha said, be heedful, be mindful, because change is the norm. That is the norm, change. It would actually be strange if everything didn't change and it was just fixed and the world just stayed the same all the time. People stayed the same, our bodies stayed the same, our minds stayed fixed, the people around us and the world around us stayed fixed all the time. You know, that would be the strange thing. But the reality is that things are changing. And if we take that as a starting point, because that was the final teaching of the Buddha, if we take that as a starting point in our practice, it begins to bring our mind already in line with the truth, with the Dhamma. And as we know, the Buddha said, one who sees the Dhamma sees the Buddha. You know, the real Buddha is the Dhamma, the truth that we bring our mind to realize and frees our mind from ignorance, delusion, greed, anger, the mental defilements that cause us suffering. Our mind is liberated from them by seeing the Dhamma, seeing the truth, or you could say seeing the Buddha. When we say seeing, what we mean is knowing the truth through our own consciousness, our own mind, knowing the truth of the way things are without doubt, so with clarity, with such deep, clear vision that there's no more room for doubt or uncertainty or confusion or deception, so that the mind knows this is the way things are. Things change, the body changes, the mind changes. That's what we mean by seeing the truth, seeing the Dhamma. It really means knowing with your heart. So coming to know the Dhamma or know the Buddha is for most of us, it's a process of practice over time, however long or short, depends maybe on how much effort we put in, how devoted we are to the practice. But it's a process of awakening and waking up and coming to the point where we know the truth. But in the beginning, we don't know the truth, and that's why we're stressed. That's why changes catch us out and make us frustrated or afraid or anxious. You know, what's going to happen next? What will happen to the world next year? And so on. Change, when we're not mindful and we're not prepared, can be a great cause for suffering in our life. Whereas somebody who is practicing these Buddhist teachings starts to become familiar with being mindful and heedful of the fact that everything changes. They become used to change rather than always resisting it or suffering because of it. It's like, for example, that monk who got ill many years ago and had to tell Ajahn Chah, because it was quite a serious illness. And he said, oh, I got ill, I think it was malaria or scrub typhus, the sort of things you get in the forest in Thailand. And Ajahn Chah's first comment was, I was expecting that. When you reflect on change every day and you become heedful of change, you're prepared for it. And it doesn't mean to say you want that change or you like it, but at least you're aware that change happens. And Ajahn Chah used to say, when you go to hospital, why do people suffer? Well, one is just the physical pain and discomfort of their illness when they get ill or injured. But the deeper suffering is the resistance to it and the determination. I don't want this. I want to recover. I want to not be ill. I want to not be injured. And we suffer more because of that. Our view that, you know, we shouldn't be ill. We shouldn't be injured. We shouldn't get sick from whatever it may be, and there's so many other things other than COVID that we can get sick from, is that determination in the mind not to be sick, and only that's the only outcome we want, is to recover. That's why we suffer, because it's not always possible to recover. It depends on many causes and conditions, many of which are out of our control. Sometimes we recover, sometimes the illness lingers for the rest of our life, sometimes it kills us. And actually bringing your mind to the point where you can say, well, if I can recover, that's good. If I've got the merit, the good karma to recover, that's good. But if it kills me, I'll have to accept that, because it's out of my hands. No one controls these things ultimately. If you can bring your mind to that point, you can be at peace. And this is how Ajahn taught us to reflect. So it's a very mature reflection, and that's perhaps why the Buddha gave it as his last teaching, is because it's something you're working towards, reflecting on over and over again every day. Things change. This body of mine is changing every day. It's aging. It can never be the same as before, because you don't get younger. In our mind, we still want to be young. We reach the age of 60 or 70, and we still want to go out traveling and partying and shopping and doing all the things we did when we were younger. And maybe even we traipse along following our younger friends or relatives, hoping to relive a little bit of our youth. But it's not possible, is it? You can't turn the clock back. That's the mind struggling because of its desires, its accumulated desires and attachments and delusions, wanting to turn the clock back. But you can't do it. You can't make your body the same as before. You won't look the same as before or feel the same as before. And the same with everything, isn't it? This is why we love to look at pictures of the past, oil paintings and paintings of past times in the world. We have all the history of art and the different eras of art, whether it's Buddhist art or European art. And the same with photographs. We love to look at old photographs of ourselves, our family, old times. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what it does is tend to bring up that nostalgia and that clinging to those memories. And it's interesting, isn't it? With, say, a photograph, you tend to just stick to that one image in your mind. That's how it was. And if it, say, brings up good memories, happy feelings, then we paint the picture of our past like that. So that's why many of us suffer with nostalgia and wishing things were the way, or just a momentary view of the past as being the good old days and how things were. And we carry that along, and that causes us suffering when we look at the present and say, oh, it's not the same as it was before. This is so bad. We're only making ourselves suffer more when we do that. So the Buddha has obviously given us a teaching, everything changes to be heedful, to use. And you can use this as a reflection every day of your life to help bring your mind in line with the Dhamma. It's a timeless truth. The Dhamma is timeless. It doesn't, in that sense, the Dhamma doesn't change, because the truth is just the truth. It's the way things are. What changes is our mind, which keeps falling into delusion, and we keep deceiving ourselves. And this is a natural, you start to notice things, how your mind is always clinging to ideas of happiness and what is good and right. It should be without pandemics, for sure. Should be no wars, should be no suffering, no illness, no problems. We cling to all kinds of ideas of what we think are happiness, and then we fix onto them in our mind. And then, of course, the world can't live up to it, so we start to suffer. We keep looking for pleasure to satisfy ourselves, different kinds of comfort and pleasure and pleasurable experiences, but they don't last. So when we bring our mind to see that, to see the impermanent on a bit, we still have our attachment to pleasure. You don't get rid of it over in one day, but your attitude towards it starts to change, doesn't it? If you start noticing the arising and ceasing of pleasurable experiences, the things we do associate with as happiness, pleasure, what we want, what we like. If you start noticing the temporary nature of all those things, your mind starts to adjust a little bit. And it may be a slow process, but little by little, if you keep reflecting, your mind tires of grasping and expecting happiness in things that can changes, disappears, temporary. So the Buddha's teaching on impermanence is, it's a lifesaver. In some situations, it's certainly a suffering saver. It saves you suffering the more you reflect on it. So for me, this has been an important time. As I said, I've just been back to the UK to visit my mother, who was at the end of her days, and perform the funeral. And now I've come back here. But, the funeral ceremony of my mother, we had a cremation in the Buddhist sense. It was a Buddhist funeral, and we had various Buddhist rituals, chantings, offerings, and so on. But after the cremation, we collected the ashes of my mother. And this is what we do, isn't it? Buddhists tend to get cremated. So that body that you once thought of as your mother, the person you love, that you've associated with all your life, has been reduced to a small pile of ashes put in a beautiful little container. And then for me, I went with my sister and family members to the Amaravati monastery, where Lumpur Sumedho, Lumpur Amaro live. And we scattered the ashes there, planting a tree and scattered the ashes in a field. And literally the ashes are just dust. So in the wind, they just blow away and disappear. And that's going on every day in the world, isn't it? Every day people in the world die, get cremated, and their ashes are scattered in mountains and forests and the rivers and the sea. Sometimes they're buried, but a human body is reduced just down to a pile of ashes. It's impermanent. That symbolizes something that runs through our life, through the world, through all of our experience. Everything we know arises and ceases. But the very knowing of that is what is bringing knowledge, understanding, and wisdom to the mind. That's what is left in the mind as we experience impermanence and reflect on it. We have the Buddha's relics, in Buddhist temples, countries, monasteries. We like to build stupas and chedis to house relics of the Buddha, little bone fragments, crystallized relics of the Buddha's body. And people love to do that and become very happy to worship the relics of the Buddha, and can be a very useful recollection. But at the same time, we have to bring up that reflection. The body, even of the Buddha, even of the great enlightened masters from the time of the Buddha till today, is reduced to just powder and a few little bone fragments. Some of them crystallize if it's an arahant, some of them don't. And then we put them in little reliquaries, little containers on a shelf or in a stupa, and we worship them. But what we're worshipping really is impermanence and the insight into impermanence, because this is what enlightens the human mind. When the mind comes in line with the Dhamma and sees everything that arises must pass away. This is the Buddha's gift to us in his last teaching. The Buddha didn't, before he passed away, the monks liked to ask the question, who will be our teacher once you're gone? And it's natural for human beings, especially when we're unenlightened, to always put things in terms of personalities, people, names, who's the one. And many of the monks thought that the Buddha would point out Venerable Mahakassapa, who was one of the most senior monks in age and had a certain gravity and presence to him. He was considered one who was very strict in his practice of the discipline, very determined in his meditation. You might say a very reliable, wise old monk. Many monks thought the Buddha would probably point out Mahakassapa, because occasionally in the lifetime of the Buddha had Mahakassapa step in for him. He'd even exchanged robes with him, which was a great honor. But the Buddha didn't point to Venerable Mahakassapa and said, he'll be your teacher now, like sort of handing the baton down to the next teacher. He didn't do that. The Buddha said, from now on, your teacher will be the Dhamma and the Vinaya. And it's fortunate for us that we still have the text, we have the Dhamma Vinaya, and we can still refer to the texts and both the written and the verbal, the oral tradition. But that's who represents the Buddha now, and it's not a person. And so the Buddha himself is already, from the time his last few months of life before he entered Parinibbana, he's already pointing out, you've got to take the Dhamma as your teacher. Ultimately, it's the Dhamma that changes the mind. And then he gave this teaching: all formations are impermanent, practice with heedfulness. If he'd put all his hopes on one monk, well, Venerable Mahakassapa or any of the other great arahants, they're arahants, so they're not going to get deluded or lead people in the wrong way. But perhaps it would have started a tradition of revering particular monks like as gurus, as the leader of the religion, and then maybe one day in later years, perhaps people might make a mistake and pick the wrong person, perhaps an unenlightened person. Maybe everything could have disappeared a lot quicker than it has. But the Buddha didn't do that. Perhaps he saw dangers in that way of thinking, because as human beings, we do love to fixate on things and make them into permanent selves. Whether it's the leader of Buddhism, we want another Buddha, that everyone would love to have another Buddha. That's why we make Buddhist statues, isn't it? We put them up there to represent the Buddha, and that is useful for us and often brings up joy and happiness when we see a Buddha statue. But it's also pointing to our inner need when we aren't fully in line with the Dhamma. We look for these external things to cling to, like a statue or an individual, a guru, somebody who we look to as the ultimate teacher or the highest teacher. And this isn't to say we shouldn't respect statues or respect senior monks or whatever. What I'm pointing to is just our habit as human beings to try and personify everything, make everything into a solid self, because that's how we view the world. We don't like to accept impermanence and the lack of self in experience. Our own mind tends to go against that because of our craving and attachment. We always are building up things to be more solid than they are, whether it's referring to ourselves, our own life, who we think we are, who we would like to be, or the world around us. Our mind's delusion keeps doing this. So the Buddha is pointing us into a tool, a reflection that can help deal with that ingrained habit of creating self out of everything, even the Dhamma, even our more superficial attachment to the Dhamma that manifests in this way. He's pointing out, as we know, when he first, before he entered the Parinibbana, he said it's okay to make a stupa for the relics of a Buddha. It's a fairly simple reflection. And relics are clearly a reminder of the impermanence of the human body. Or he said you can make a place of worship at the foot of the Bodhi tree, empty seats at the foot of Bodhi trees. He actually didn't encourage the making of statues, because he knows that what the human beings do. They love to make a person out of everything. We love to label everything. It's the conventional reality that we build up through our lives and through society and through language and the use of concepts. We're constantly creating this sense of solidity, permanency, self, something that we can cling to and identify with. And this is where we're constantly getting caught out. And the Buddha said, one who sees through that, sees through the impermanence and selfless nature of phenomena, sees through these labels and the conventions of language and concepts, that person will see the Dhamma, and they'll see the selfless nature of things. They'll actually liberate their mind from suffering. So the Buddha was encouraging us to always come back to the Dhamma, the truth in our experience. And sometimes that's as simple as just bringing up the reflection on all formations are impermanent, be heedful. You know, as you go to work in the morning, all formations are impermanent. So at the moment in Melbourne, everybody's going, well, what's the latest change in the rules? What can I do? What can't I do? Where can I go? Where can't I go? Do I wear a mask? Do I do this? It's like that, isn't it? Every day things change. Be heedful of that. Every day your body changes. You don't know when you wake up in the morning quite how you'll feel, whether you'll be ill or strong, maybe you have backache or stomach ache, or maybe you feel very energized and very bright some days. It's uncertain though, isn't it? It's not sure. It's subject to change. As you go into work, how your work colleagues will treat you. They'll greet you with a smile and talk nicely to you, or they'll totally ignore you, or maybe they'll even be grumpy and say something not very nice. It's uncertain, isn't it? But one who's mindful of change is aware that that can happen. At least you're aware of the possibilities, the different possibilities of what may arise. You're open to that. You understand things are not sure. You can use it in this way as a mantra to go about your business. And you know, sometimes Buddhism is, people find it a bit daunting to study and practice Buddhism, especially if you're living in the lay life with a job that requires a lot of time and energy to perform complex tasks. You have family to look after, money to control and look after. Sometimes to study Buddhism seems like a burden. There's a lot to learn, to read, a lot of theory, you might say. Some people really get into that and find it helpful, but others find it a burden because they're not sure how much to learn, and they learn from different teachers, different books, and find they get an overload of knowledge or conflicting opinions on the teachings. So sometimes it's actually good to have some very simple reflections you can turn to at different times, especially if you're at work. You know, at work, you haven't got time to pull out the Tripitaka and study and read up on different aspects of daily life. You know, say you're feeling tired or stressed in the middle of your day. You know, you can't read the Tripitaka and analyze what's going on, maybe. But to bring up a simple reflection like, you know, things change. How I feel changes. How other people act, speak changes. I must be mindful of this. That much you can bring up at any time, and you don't need a lot of background reading. You don't need to carry all the volumes of the Tripitaka to work with you to get that reflection. You've got it with you in your mind because it's a very simple one. And it's like a little tool you can carry around and just bring out when you need it. When do you need it? Well, often it's when you're stressed, isn't it? When you're faced with unexpected change, when suddenly you're thrown by your own emotions, you know, a different thought comes up, suddenly you feel stressed, angry, worried. Sometimes you're very excited and happy over something that's come out of the blue. Who knows? Change comes in many different ways. But you have this reflection to bring up. Everything is subject to change. Everything can change. It's like a little voice of wisdom in the back of your mind, just quietly bringing you back down to earth in the middle of whatever is arising for you. When things are going well, you're aware things can change. Maybe what was going well may change. When things are going badly, it can change. It's not sure. That one simple teaching the Buddha gave us is so profound, you know, it can lead us from where we are right now all the way to Nibbana if we pursue it and deepen our reflection on it. But just because it's a profound teaching that can bring you to Nibbana doesn't mean to say you can't use it in the middle of your busy daily life or traveling or with your kids or working or doing whatever you're doing. You can bring it up. Things change. Everything is not sure. Be mindful of that. you notice when suffering does come up in your life, how often it's because you've drifted away from that simple reflection. And maybe you've started pinning your hopes on something. I want to get this. I want to get this sorted. I want to get this result. And it's not happening because of change. Things don't go the way we plan always. Other people are not acting the way we expected. The world around us changes. It's at those times we start to suffer because we've lost sight of the fact that everything is impermanent and changing and subject to causes and conditions. When you're stressed and suffering, just come back and remind yourself, but things are not sure. And it can help you when you're suffering, because you remind yourself, I'm suffering now with this problem that's come up, but things can change. Just as suffering can arise, suffering passes away. And it's like little by little, you're educating yourself, you're learning about the truth from your own experience as a human being, with your own body, your own mind, in the present moment, wherever you are, becoming mindful of change, and it's liberating. And it doesn't take much to bring up that reflection, just a moment, pause, bring up the thought, everything can change. As a monk, you learn this and you become used to it all the time, just reflecting on change. Sometimes it's humorous, and I think even the Buddha would joke about it sometimes, or point out the humorous side of, the person who wants something and is building all their expectations up, and then they just don't get what they want, because life is like that, isn't it? We don't always get what we want, or we get what we don't want. Nobody wants lockdown, but suddenly you've got lockdown. Nobody wants travel restrictions, but suddenly you've got travel restrictions. Nobody wants to get ill, but sometimes you get ill. Nobody wants to die, but we all have to die. It's a very profound teaching or reflection, but you can use it in very minor, almost trivial matters, as much as you can use it in the more deeper, profound matters of life. Everyone who meditates understands this, don't they? You practice meditation, you sit down, and when you're not clear, craving arises. I want peace. I want to feel peaceful as I meditate. I want my mind to be calm, mindful, under my control. And sometimes it is, but a lot of the time it's not, is it? And you just have to be with that and accept it. But if you have this reflection, it's not sure, it's subject to change, that helps you to be with it, doesn't it? You're, it's not sure. My desire for peace is not sure. The experience of my mind at this time, peaceful, agitated, tired, energized, whatever, is not sure. That maybe is where you'll find the real peace, or the deeper peace, is being aware of the unfolding, changeable nature of your experience. And meditation is where you're really and becoming very aware in moment by moment of the changing nature of your experience as you meditate. This is why even if you are leading a busy life with family, with work, it's still good to find time for meditation, where you can maybe set aside all these other duties temporarily and really refine your awareness of developing this quality of knowing your own body and mind from moment to moment in a period of meditation. So that's where you're really, deepening and learning that lesson on a more profound level. You're seeing literally every thought arising, passing away, that it's impermanent. It starts and then it finishes. Every sensation, every feeling, sight, sound, taste, touch, memories, pain, pleasure and pain in the body. When you're doing a period of formal meditation, sitting, walking, it really helps you to see that very closely, and that gives you some strength of mind and some wisdom that you can then carry on for the rest of your day, when you maybe can't do formal meditation, but you can still return to some of that insight that you've been developing in your formal meditation. And maybe once a day, in the morning or in the evening, or even twice a day. And sometimes at those times, they don't yet have any great insight. They're just watching and learning from the experience of a body that changes, a mind that changes, sometimes peaceful, sometimes not. But then they find at other times, even when they're not expecting it because of change, insight can pop into the mind when the conditions are right, maybe in the middle of work or the middle of some activity, driving a car, walking to the shops or something, the mind just returns to its reflection on impermanence and just catches what may be arising at that moment, and you're seeing a certain mood arising in permanent, and you have a deep, profound before you would have indulged in and held on to around it for a while. You worry, anger, fear, desire of some sort. But because of this meditation you've been doing and learning and observing impermanence in your meditation, finally it gives its result and the mind just suddenly goes quiet when it should be suffering or excited, happy or sad. You know, at a time where it would normally be falling into its mood, the mind has a clear insight, this is impermanent. And that sense of detached, cool, calm awareness arises maybe at that moment. Can literally be anywhere, anytime. It arises and there's a sort of sense of separation, the mind that's just stepping back and letting go of its normal attachment to the emotion, the feeling, the thought, how the body is, how the mind is at that moment. And that's a more profound kind of insight into impermanence. And it's even, sometimes it leads on to a lot of wisdom arising. You're reflecting, oh, why on earth do I get angry about those things? When you have a moment when you let go of some anger and you're clear and you're mindful at that moment. And then the next moment is, why do I always get angry? And I can let go of it. And when I'm free from anger, I'm happy, I'm peaceful. You really learn then, don't you? Because the next time you're falling into anger, it may arise. If the triggers are there, anger may arise. But you've now got that memory, that knowledge that, I've let go of this before. And it arose and it passed away before. And I saw that, I knew that. So now your mind may have a certain new attitude, wiser, more mature attitude, you might say, towards your own mood of anger at that new time it's arising. And you may be able to let it go straight away, but same with anxiety, worry about health, the world, money, all the things that cause worry, our family, kids, whatever. Using this reflection and meditating regularly, it starts to become part of who you are then. And this is what we call wisdom, panya. What makes the Buddha is wisdom, insight into the process where suffering arises, but also how to end it, let go of the clinging, the attachment that causes it. Wisdom is what frees our mind from suffering, which is what we all want. There's a certain amount of suffering in this world we can't change. We have to just be patient with, face. It's normal. Just what we call dukkha, the normal dukkha of being a human being. You're born, you have to get older. Sometimes you get sick, even injured. One day you must die. That's the kind of normal level of suffering. But then on top of that, there's this additional suffering we create out of our experience. The worries, the fears, the greed, the grasping, the desiring, the ambitions, the wants, the jealousies. These are the additional kinds of suffering that we create out of our experience over and over again, and often reinforce that kind of suffering because we don't see, we deceive ourselves, keep believing these thoughts that come up in our mind, the emotions, the negative emotions, we cling on to them, attach them, identify with them. The reflection on impermanence is helping to reduce and ultimately remove that kind of unnecessary or additional suffering. And if you've ever done it once, it's like a little victory that you can then rely on and say, that worked before, I can do it again. So what part of the Buddha's message is that we have a potential for this as human beings. We can teach ourselves using the teachings of the Buddha and the good example of the Buddha, the Sangha, but drawing that into our own experience and reflecting on it. Of course, it is important to learn the Dhamma, hear the Dhamma. It's not that we should just ignore what the teachers say or ignore the books. They play a role. They're like starting the process where you hear the Dhamma and it starts to make sense and brings up some of that joy and the interest. That's an important part of the process of learning to free ourselves from suffering. But we have to go on from there. We have to, once we've heard the Dhamma, then we have to set the words aside, the external words, and then start looking at the internal experience. And in the beginning, maybe just comparing what the Buddha said, this body is impermanent. This body is unattractive. It has its repulsive side. This body is not a self that we can own and control. It's not me, mine, myself. It's actually, natural elements of earth, air, fire, and water come together. That's something we have to start knowing from the inside. Because the superficial appearance is, it's me, it's mine, myself. And as soon as you have the attachment to self in this body, then you've got the causes for fear, for anxiety, for greed, for lust, for attachment. If that's not investigated, questioned, looked at, well, that's how we live. We live on that more superficial level. So we're a human being with a name and a personal history and a job, and we go around, we have our family and our friends, and we live in a certain place, and we have COVID restrictions, and we have this and we have that. That's the normal way human beings are relating to the world on this more superficial level. And of course, underneath the surface, there's all kinds of desires, fears and desires, conditioning them, affecting them, craving and looking for pleasure and success, fearing pain, fearing failure. That's all going on. But as we start to practice the Dhamma, meaning drawing in what the Buddha taught on these different levels into our heart, and then start to observe the mind itself and what's going on, we start to see, well, there's a deeper truth here. And the superficial appearance of things, the samuti satcha, the conventional reality that we are working with most of the time, starts to be looked at a slightly different, from a different angle, or put into perspective. This thing we call a self is actually a collection of elements, earth, air, fire, water, different parts, component parts. And each of those elements and component parts, the skin, the bones, the blood, not particularly nice to look at, but also they're not a self. They're impermanent, they're subject to change, and they're not a self that we can really say is me, mine, myself. They're elements of nature. As we start looking more deeply, that kind of truth becomes more clear to us, and it puts the superficial appearance of things in perspective. And that allows us to let go of things. You can let go of fears, desires, when you're seeing the impermanent nature of your body. The same with feelings, what we call Vedanānupassana. When you are contemplating feelings, you realize, the most pleasurable feelings and happy experiences you can have are only that much because they still arise and pass away. They're not permanent. The most painful feelings we can have are not permanent. Perhaps they're harder to consider them equally. Indifferent feelings similarly arise and pass away. So whether it's sukha, dukkha, or upekkha, vedana, the three kinds of vedana, they all have one thing in common: they arise and they cease. Again, that's breaking through this sense of self and this attachment to the superficial reality of things, the conventions of things that we're normally bound up with, lost in. Now you're going down to a deeper level and saying, okay, well, these things exist. There are feelings. There's a body, there's feelings, but they're not a me, mine, myself. They're not a being or a person. They're not a fixed entity. They're ultimately conditions that arise, pass away. And if you're mindful of feelings, you'll definitely see change and no change, because no feeling is there all day long, is it? Sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain, sometimes neutral. And the same with the citta, what we call cittanupassana. This mind and its moods, its thoughts, its moods, its emotions, they're changing, aren't they? Anger is there for a while, and then it passes away. Happiness, pleasure is there for a while, it passes away. The mind is in samadhi for a while, and then it passes away. The mind is full of fear for a while, and it passes away. These different mental states arise and pass away. And little by little, as we practice mindfulness, awareness, and reflect on the impermanence of our experience, it becomes clear to the mind. You say, the mind is like a vessel, you could say an empty vessel, and then there's these moods and thoughts and feelings that come into it, arising through different causes and conditions, and then they pass away. Maybe after a while you start to become more aware of that, and you want to really look after your mind, and you say, I don't want greed, anger, and delusion coming into my mind anymore, because it's caused me so much suffering in the past. No, I don't want that. So the Buddha's encouragement was to develop the path, what we call magga, the Eightfold Noble Path. Sila, Samadhi, Panya, particularly mindfulness. Why? Well, because mindfulness is this quality where you know from moment to moment, when you're mindful, what's going on, and particularly your own mind. The Buddha compared the mindfulness to like the gatekeeper. The cities in the old days, they had their inner wall. There'd be walled cities with a gate for protection. You have a gatekeeper that watches who comes in, who comes out, and if there's a thief or a bad guy, a known bad guy coming in, then the gatekeeper can stop, close the gate if needed, question who's coming in. And just like the monks this evening, they'd gone to the border from Victoria into South Australia. The border police stopped them. Where are you going? What are you doing? And, oh, we're going to Bodhipala Monastery, and they've got their documentation. Okay, so they give them the green light. They're allowed to go through. That's mindfulness, how it works. And we have to develop that in our own hearts, to watch over all this sense contact, all this contact with the world we have every day. Because that's where suffering comes from ultimately, isn't it? Where does anger come from? You see something and you don't like it, it brings with it an unpleasant feeling. You hear something, you experience something unpleasant, it can put you into a mood of anger straight away. But mindfulness can be there maybe to guard. It still knows the unpleasant experience, but it guards from your mind falling into those negative trains of thought at that moment. Mindfulness practice with some patience and some wisdom can say, okay, it's unpleasant, and let it just drop there. Let the suffering fade straight away, rather than holding on to it, building it up into a sense of a person. I am suffering with this painful feeling, or with this thing that that person said, or this experience that's happened, or not getting what I want. You can be mindful at that moment and let the anger go. This is how we practice to stop this external kind of suffering, this extra or unnecessary kind of suffering in life. You still have a body, so you're still going to have some painful experiences, but the pain of the mind, the mental states, can be abandoned if the gatekeeper is doing his job. If the border police are checking who's coming in, who's doing the right thing, the wrong thing, that's mindfulness at work in daily life. And this is why the Buddha encouraged us, you go to work, take your mindfulness with you. We don't forget our phone, our money, our car keys normally. If you come to the monastery, sometimes you do, because I know sometimes we pick up your car keys when you lose them, and we pick up your wallets when you forget them. So people do even forget these things, but normally you don't. In the same way, don't forget to take your mindfulness with you when you go to work, when you go to that dinner party, when you go shopping, when you're waking up in the morning. See your mindfulness as your most valuable friend, your valuable asset. This is real meditation in practice, and it's not any different from daily life. because you're a person living in daily life, breathing, thinking, but use mindfulness to guide that. You know, just ask yourself every time you're picking up your mobile phone for the next walk to the next room or next action you're going to do, next activity or next activity on the phone, you stop and say, have I got my mindfulness with me right now? You know, nowadays, everyone in the world almost has access to mobile phone or something similar, and it becomes an obsession, doesn't it? And it becomes a habit and it's just normal. That's the level of mindfulness you need. In the same way as you reach for your mobile phone, reach for your mindfulness. I mean, establish mindfulness with speech, with action, with thought, as you're going through your day, with breath in, breath out. That's what you're aiming for. Maybe setting aside the mobile phone might actually help a bit, you know, because it might bring you more mindfulness, because it's so obsessive. We very easily get lost in it and deluded, caught up in all the technology and the information we're getting. But that's the level of practice we're aiming for, is to carry our mindfulness around with us as this most valuable quality. This is how the Buddha practiced. This is how Ajahn Chah practiced. This is how anyone who's developed the Buddhist path has practiced over the centuries to this very day. Because it's what guards the mind, protects the mind, it gives you the right, it prepares the mind for all the change that's coming day by day, puts you in the best position, the most prepared position to deal with whatever may come up. You know, one thing people love to do, isn't it? They go to the astrologer and they try and sort it out that way. How's my year going to be? Am I going to get COVID? Will I make more money? Will I fall in love? Will I divorce? Will I build a house, buy a new car? You know, we love to go to the astrologer to try and get it all down, but the astrologer never knows all the details. Things change, karma changes, and they may be fairly accurate, but they're never perfectly accurate. What tends to happen is our own mind tries to fit everything in with what the astrologer says. Why not put all that effort into establishing mindfulness and reflecting on your own intentions, your own body, speech, and mind, what you're doing, the karma you're making, might be more valuable to you. Again, the unenlightened person is always looking for the easy options. So we go to the Buddha, instead of establishing mindfulness and meditating, we pray to the Buddha, asking Buddha to solve our problems, asking the monk for a blessing, or we go to the astrologer to get the auspicious days so we don't have to worry about it anymore. Worst scenario, we go to someone to try and get them to put some magic out there to sort of fix our problems. Or we go to the doctor and say, fix my illness, when sometimes they can't, or sometimes they can only help us a bit. We're always putting our hopes and expectations out on the world or on other people. You know, this person's got to do what I want, then I'll be happy. When my parents understand me and do what I want, I'll be happy. When my children understand me, I'll be happy. When my children look after me, I'll be happy. When my parents give me the nicely to me, I'll be happy. When my enemies leave my life, then I'll be happy. We do it the wrong way around. The Buddha said, you can't control all these things, and those kind of expectations are easily disappointed and frustrated. Turn it around and say, when I'm mindful, I can be happy. If I bring up mindfulness, I can be happy. When I'm mindful, I can reflect and use my mind to see that things are impermanent, to understand the causes and conditions affecting my life better. I can train my mind to abandon unskillful thoughts better when I'm mindful. Turn it around this way. You reach for your phone, you reach for your mindfulness. When you think of that person, think of your own mindfulness. When you're criticizing another person, you stop and say, well, what about me? How many faults have I got? It's one of the basics of practice Ajahn Chah used to say, is we tend to look at other people 90% of the time. You use your mobile phone to connect with other people, think about them, connect with them 90% of the time. Your conversations, your eyes, your actions are involved with the world out there 90% of the time, and only 10% of the time we're looking at ourselves. We have to turn it around. 90% of the time, look at yourself, know yourself. 10% of the time you give over to the world, so you know roughly what's going on, enough to interact skillfully, wisely with the world. But where you can really affect change for the better is in yourself, isn't it? So turn these statistics around, be more mindful of yourself, and this will improve your relations with the world, the physical world, the mental world, people. These will improve the more mindful aware we are. But try and turn this dynamic around so we're looking inwards more, and outwardly we know enough to get by. We don't need to know everything in the world. You know, there's no end to that, is there? You could sit on your phone Googling the world all day, all at night, every day, and still you wouldn't know yourself. Still you wouldn't be free from suffering. And that's not to say technology is a waste of time or harmful, but it can be. Everything we do can go in one way or another, isn't it? We can use technology to help people, to develop medicines, antidotes, share information, get all kinds of work done in a very good way, to share the Dhamma just as we are now. Or when we're not very mindful, it becomes harmful, doesn't it? We become obsessed with it. We start using it to pursue greed, anger, and delusion more, to create weapons, conflict, to get caught into unwholesome desires and get confused and suffer with that, and so on. To disseminate wrong information, false information, and get caught into that, suffer for that. You know, it can go both ways. So the Buddhist practice is about learning to develop what is the path and what is not. And the path is always coming back to yourself, develop a sense of initial mindfulness of body and speech, calming yourself, not creating a lot of waves, making waves with other people and creating a lot of suffering in the world, so that you can look deeper at your own mind and see some of these truths the Buddha was pointing to. All formations are impermanent. Be heedful. Your body will change. You will get older. Your mind is changing every day. People around you in the world is changing every day. Be mindful of that. Be heedful, because this can free you from suffering. So I think the title of tonight's talk was One Who Sees the Buddha Sees the Dhamma. One who sees the Dhamma sees the Buddha. So one who sees impermanence, one who sees not self, sees the Buddha. When you look at the Buddha statue or picture next time, you know, bring up that mindfulness and reflect. All things are impermanent. All things are not self. Even the Buddha got old, got sick, died. Even if we build a stupa and put his relics there and worship, it can be a very good thing to do. But in the end, we're just reminding ourselves of impermanence. So maybe for now, I'll just say this much and wish you all well in your practice. And on Wesak, it's a good time just to recollect the Buddha and his life and teachings. And may you all progress in your practice of those teachings. And may the wisdom of the Buddha, may that grow in your own mind. May you all come to see the Dhamma in the same way that the Buddha did.